Hey guys, and welcome back. In this video, we'll be adding vicious enemies to our game worlds. Alright, so I have imported this crunchy little enemy character. Like usual, if you want to go ahead and make some cool art yourself, this will be the time to do it. Otherwise, you can just create a simple square and you will be able to follow along just as well. It's up to you. Now, let's add to him the Photon View component. If you have forgotten, the Photon View component is one of the prerequisites that we need in order to spawn our enemy over the network. The other is to turn him into a prefab inside of the resources folder. I'll now create a new C# script called enemy. Once it has been created, I'll drag and drop it onto my enemy prefab. Let's start by making some variables. So we'll need a reference to the two players with an array of type player controller called players, and then a variable of the same type called nearest player, since we would like each enemy to chase after the nearest one. Then a public float variable for the speeds. Alright, so now inside of the start function, we'll find the two players by using the find objects of type function and passing in player controller as the type. So this line will basically search our scene for any object that has a player controller script attached to it, and then it will store them inside of our players array. Now let's find the closest player. So I'll create a float variable called distance1 that will be equal to vector2.distance between this enemy's transform.position and the first player's transform.position, so the player of index 0. Likewise, we'll also create a float variable called distance2, which will be equal this time to the distance between the enemy and the second player, so player of index 1. Then, if the distance between the enemy and the first player is smaller than the distance between the enemy and the second player, that means the first player is closer, and so we'll set nearest player to be equal to the first player. Else, so if the distance with the first player is greater than the distance with the second player, then we'll set nearest player to be equal to player 2. So if nearest player exists, and it almost always will, this is just to be extra safe, not to cause any errors. Well then we can move the enemy towards the player using vector2.moveTowards. First parameter is the position we're moving from, so the enemy's current position. And the second parameter is where it's moving to, which is of course the nearest player's position. Finally, let's set how fast the enemy moves using our speed variable and multiplying it with time.deltaTime. Okay, so to quickly recap, every single frame we're calculating the distance between the enemy and the players. Then we're comparing both of them together to figure out which player is the nearest to the enemy. If distance 1 is smaller than distance 2, then player 1 is nearest, otherwise it is player 2. Then, once we know who is the nearest player, we are moving towards him thanks to this vector2.moveTowards function. And that's it. Now, we need a way to spawn these vicious devils inside of our game. Let's start off by creating a bunch of spawn points for our enemies. So I'll create an empty game object called spawn points. You can give it a red gizmo here, for example, so that it is easily visible inside of the scene view. Then just keep duplicating this object until you have enough spawn points all around your scene. Then we'll create another empty game object called spawner. Next, we'll make a new C# script called spawner, and once it has been created, we can drag and drop it onto our newly created spawner object. Inside the script, we'll make a public transform array called spawn points, which, you guessed it, will store all of our spawn points that we made. Then we'll make a public game object variable called enemy, which will store our enemy prefab. We want these enemies to spawn every few seconds, so I'll create a public float start time between spawn and a private float time between spawn variables. We will also import the photon.pun namespace to get access to the main multiplayer functionalities of Photon. Inside of the update function, we'll check if time between spawn is less than or equal to 0. If it is, that means it's time to spawn in a new enemy. Else, we'll slowly decrease this time between spawn variable using minus equals time.deltaTime. So if it's time to spawn in an enemy, then I'll type photonnetwork.instantiate. The first parameter is the name of the prefab inside of the resources folder that we want to spawn. So I'll type enemy.name. Next, we need to give a spawn position. For that, we'll create a vector3 spawn position variable that will be equal to a random spawn point position. So here we're just generating a random number between 0 and the length of the spawn point array, and we're using that number for the index, which will give us a random element in the array. So now we can just use this spawn position for our second parameter in our instantiate function. And finally, for the rotation, we'll just pass in quaternion.identity since we don't want any rotation. Then don't forget to set time between spawn equal to start time between spawn, so that we restart the counter and wait a few seconds again before spawning in a new foe. You'll also probably want to set time between spawn equal to start time between spawn inside of the start function, to give players a few seconds before enemies appear. If we leave things like this though, enemies will spawn in twice, since there will be in total 2 instances of this script running in our game, once for each player in the room. So instead, we would like them to spawn on only the master client, in other words, the one that created the room. We can do so by checking with an if statement if this spawner is not on the master client. So if photon network.isMasterClient equals false. If that's the case, then we'll return, meaning all the code beneath this won't run. I'll complete this if statement with a NOR sign by also checking whether there isn't 2 players in the room. So if photonnetwork.currentroom.playerCount is not equal to 2. This way, we'll only start spawning enemies if we are on the master client and once both players are ready. Alright, so to quickly recap, we have got a timer system that allows us to spawn in a new enemy character each couple of seconds. Once it is time to spawn, we first of all fetch a random spawn point. Then we are instantiating over the network a new enemy at our random spawn point position and with no rotation. Of course, we are only spawning our enemies if we are on the master client, in other words, the player that created the room, and if both players are in the room. Alright, let's save our script and then we can jump back inside of Unity. With my spawner object selected, I'll lock the inspector by pressing on this lock sign up here, so that I can now drag and drop my spawn positions inside of the array. We'll then drag and drop the enemy prefab in the slot, and then I'll have them spawn every 3 seconds, for example. It's now time to test, so I'll build the game by pressing Ctrl B or Command B if you're on a Mac. And hopefully it works as well as it does for us. Our enemies are getting beautifully spawned all around our map and they're chasing our nearest player. Amazing work. Anyways, that's it for now. I'll see you in the next video. Cheers!